Hey guys, Tom here from the Investing with Tom YouTube channel. Welcome back to the channel, happy to have you along. Before we get into today's video, I just want to give a big shout out to Matt over in Aussie at the Millennial Investor YouTube channel. He gave me a shout out last week or earlier this week, and I've had a lot of new subscribers. So if you've come across from that video, welcome along, welcome to the channel, and thank you again, Matt. So let's get into today's video. Alright, so today what we're going to talk about is I'm going to go through my top 3 investing podcasts, my favorite investing podcasts that I like to listen to. So I really enjoy the podcast format of kind of learning and getting content into my brain. So I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts when I'm driving, when I'm at work, when I'm at home cooking dinner or whatever it might be. So I thought I'd run you through my top 3, give you my reasons why, and a little bit of a synopsis, kind of what those podcasts are about and why you might enjoy listening to them too. So without further ado, let's get into it. So coming in at number 3 on my top 3 favorite investing podcasts is The Investors Podcast, also known as The Investors Podcast, We Study Billionaires. So this is a really popular investing podcast from what I can gather. This is generally kind of the first or second one that comes up when you literally just search investing on the podcast app on your iPhone. And it's run by 2 guys predominantly. So Stig Brodersen and Preston Pish. I hope I haven't butchered your names there. I think that's how they're pronounced. So they run the Investors Podcast. They both are highly qualified in finance. They have slightly different backgrounds, but essentially they run a podcast where they talk about a range of different investing topics. So for the most part, they are sort of value investor kind of oriented, but they also have a lot of guests on that talk about slightly different approaches to investing. So things like momentum investing, deep value investing. So they have a regular guest by the name of Toby Carlisle, who has actually written a book called The Acquirer's Multiple, and he's into more of a Ben Graham style approach to investing, looking at real core fundamentals of value and not necessarily looking for the higher quality companies that the modern day investor might be looking at. So that's a couple of the reasons why I really enjoy that podcast. They also have some pretty high profile guests on. So they've had Tony Robbins on the podcast before, really famous and popular kind of life and investing coach, and a guy whose book I've actually just recently finished as well. So they've had Tony Robbins on the podcast. They've also had Monish Pabrai on the podcast. So if you're not familiar with Monish Pabrai, he's an Indian gentleman based in the States that has been investing with value principles since around the late 90s from what I can gather, after selling his technology company for a few $1 million. And he has returned in the high 20% annual rates of return for a number of years, and is basically one of the best investors on the planet, a guy that I try to follow really closely, and I've actually got his book in the mail, The Danielle Investor, at the moment as well. So those are a few of the reasons why I enjoy the Investors Podcast, and they are coming in at number 3. So let's get into number 2. So, number 2 on my top 3 investing podcast has a very similar name to the previous one, but this time we've thrown a young in there. So it's the Young Investors Podcast. And this one is run by a couple of gents over in Australia. They both run YouTube channels as well. So there's Hamish, who runs the Hamish YouTube channel, and Brandon, whose surname I actually am not familiar with. Brandon runs the Aussie Wealth Creation YouTube channel, which you may or may not be familiar with. And recently they started a podcast called the Young Investors Podcast. So the reason this one's a little bit higher up on the list than the Investors Podcast, which was in number 3, is these guys have essentially the exact same investing strategy as myself, and we're also similar ages and are interested in similar companies and all that kind of stuff. So basically their strategy in investing is to find great companies with big moats or competitive advantages, that have great management, that they understand, and they can buy at a significant discount to what we believe those companies to be worth. So we're giving ourselves a big margin of safety to try and generate some much greater returns with quite low levels of risk. So that's essentially the strategy that they employ. And on the podcast itself, they go into individual companies and analyzing those stocks and seeing whether they are worthy of investment, And they also go through basically weekly news, what's going on in the markets, what's possibly causing those changes in the markets week to week. But predominantly their strategy is long-term focused, and the topics that they tend to cover are really focused around the long-term investor, and also some beginner investors, because there are obviously a lot of beginner investors around kind of our age group, early mid-20s. And there's a lot of questions that come along as well that are quite common amongst newer investors. So for example, they recently had an episode looking at finding the best broker, what you might want to look for in a broker, in terms of credibility, in terms of fees, and in terms of how safe those brokers are and what kind of services they might offer as well. So if that's something you're interested in, I would definitely recommend checking out the Young Investors podcast. They upload, I think, on the iTunes sort of podcast app, on Spotify as well, and they also put the episodes up on YouTube. So I'm going to link all of these podcasts down in the description below, so if you're looking to track them down and can't find them by just plugging a name in, which I'm sure you could, I'll put the link down below as well, so be sure to check them out there. So that's number 2. Let's get into podcast number 1. And last but not least, podcast number 1, my favorite investing podcast out there, is Invested. And this is a podcast run by Phil Town and his daughter Danielle Town. So if you don't know who Phil Town is, essentially he's a value style investor that again buys high quality companies when they're at a big discount to their intrinsic value, or what he calls their sticker price. Phil's also an author, and I've actually got his book right here, one of his books. I'm currently reading Rule 1 by Phil Town, and I'm planning to get through his other couple of books in the next couple of months. So Phil's an author. He's been investing for over 35 years, and he's taught thousands and thousands of people across the states and around the world how to invest, taking people from a rank beginner through to making their first investment and generating some really high rates of return. So in terms of what the Invested podcast is all about, Phil spent years of his life teaching people how to invest. He's managed money and invested money very successfully for a long period of time. But one person who's never really, learnt from Phil up until this podcast started was his own daughter, Danielle Town. So Danielle is a very successful lawyer. She works in early stage corporate law, working with startups and venture capital type companies. Venture capital type investors and the companies that those investors are getting into, but she's never really gone about investing herself up until this podcast began. So essentially the podcast starts out with Danielle as kind of a rank beginner in investing, and Phil taking her through the process of learning how to invest, learning the principles behind it, and eventually making her first investment as well, and being quite successful on that. So the podcast is, I think, coming up on around 200 episodes now. I may be slightly out there, but it has been running for a few years now, and it starts out with Danielle asking quite simple questions that a lot of people are probably wondering if they are starting out investing, and now it's to the point where she actually has full-on debates with Phil, and they're on a very similar level in terms of what their thought patterns are doing in terms of getting into investing. So that's a podcast that I really like. They have episodes come out weekly. They're very consistent with releasing episodes every week, and I've listened to a lot of them a couple of times now. So very good podcast. I highly recommend it. Phil and Danielle have actually recently released their own book together as well, which again I'm hoping to read in the next couple of months. So that is by far number 1 favorite podcast of mine. So that's kind of my top 3. Let me know your thoughts. Have you listened to any of these podcasts? And is there any I've missed? I know there's a lot more popular podcasts out there, especially focused around entrepreneurship, the likes of the Tim Ferriss podcast and all those kinds of things. So if I've missed any popular podcasts that you enjoy, really appreciate it if you drop me a comment down below and let me know, what am I missing out on? And let me know if you've heard these podcasts, and hopefully this will give you something to listen to and learn from as well. So hope you enjoyed the video. Again, if you're new to the channel, welcome along. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Give me a like on the video, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.